Hey guys, welcome to part 2 of my RC Maker Pro build for the A800. Today we're going to be focusing on shocks and dampers, how to remove them from the car, how to put them back in the car, and also the settings that can be adjusted to change the characteristics of the spring and the dampening. So here we have the A800. We're going to be going through the shocks and dampers. So firstly we take off the suspension P07 clip. So this is all just to get our damper out of the car. You have to disconnect the damper from the hub, so that's what connects your shock to your hub, and also loosen and take out the screw that holds your damper in. So now you can just go ahead, bit of a wiggle, and your damper is out. So we'll just take this part out. So this is what connects our shock to the car itself. So here I've got an Awesomatix damper and spring. So we've got damper, spring, this is the damper lever that comes out of the damper, and we've also got the ride height screw and the SRS screw. So basically we can use all of these to adjust how the shock works, the shock characteristics and the spring rate. So we can also change springs. So here we go, I'll just show you how to take the spring off here. It quite simply unclips. Alright. So there you have an Awesomatix spring. So this in particular is a soft spring. We've got hard and soft, so two main versions. The reason for that is you don't want to be running on extremes of the SRS settings, and what that means is you want to be in a nice sweet spot, and you don't want to be putting too much pressure on the spring or not enough. So generally, the really big aggressive shock spring changes we'll do with the spring, and the finer adjusting we'll do with the SRS here. So generally we run the hard spring. I've found recently that the soft spring works pretty well, especially for low traction asphalt. So I've been using it a bit out there. The reason for that is that it seems like the soft one's a bit more progressive. It starts off softer and ramps up, and what that does is it gives the car more initial traction. So I've found it actually makes the car quite a lot more aggressive on low traction. With the harder spring, it is harder initially. It tends to give the car a little bit less aggression. It makes it smoother for me. Also, you can adjust the angle of the spring. So you can see this is bent on an angle up here. So this angle comes kit at 98 degrees. That means that the distance between the outside of here to the outside of here is 48 millimeters. That's the progressive setting. We also have a linear setting. So what that means is we then bend that spring an extra mil that way. And what that does is that offsets the spring off this notch here. So if you can see there's a bit of a notch in this damper output shaft here. So what that does is then that puts this off there. So when you pull the damper up and the damper goes through its range of motion, the spring has a little bit of a distance to move before it hits that stopper. So in essence, you're only bending this part of the spring until the later part, when this then hits on that part of the damper output shaft. And what that does is that means that the shock is linear when it's doing that, and then as soon as that touches, it makes the spring more progressive, because then it's bending this and this, so it stiffens up. And that gives you a progressive spring. With the 98, it's always on there, so it's always progressive. So you can adjust the amount you bend this. Usually, if we don't run 98, we run 110 degrees. And what that does is that offsets it and basically makes it softer initially and ramps up to be harder. And you can measure the 110 degrees between the very outside of here and the very outside of the top of here. And that measurement is 49 millimeters. So that's just a nice tuning option that we have. Generally, you only run the linear spring on the rear, not on the front, because it just plants the rear of the car a lot better. But obviously that's different for different tracks and different traction levels, so it's just kind of something that you have to kind of try yourself. So to explain how our damper settings work, basically we've got two screws. So you've got the SRS and you've got the ride height screw. So this screw adjusts your ride height, this screw adjusts your spring setting. So basically all we're changing when we're adjusting the stiffness of the spring is we're changing the contact point of the ride height screw on the spring. So what I'll do is I'll just put this spring back on just to give you a bit of a look at how exactly all this works. Alrighty, so our screw here, that's the ride height screw. That's putting pressure on our spring. This is just the SRS screw. So that adjusts where this ride height screw touches on the spring. And depending where that ride height screw touches, that's going to change the stiffness of the spring. So if the ride height screw is touching further in here, obviously there's more of a lever out here and it's going to soften the spring. If the ride height screw is touching here, for instance, it's less of a lever and that's going to stiffen the spring. So basically just by adjusting where this whole assembly is, we can adjust the stiffness of just the spring alone. So we can use what's called a feeler gauge here, and we have adjustments on there which we can slip in here and adjust where exactly that's sitting. So we have two settings, you would say, SRS1 and SRS2. So at the moment you can see SRS2. So SRS1 basically allows us to look at the harder ranges of the spring, whereas SRS2 allows us to look at the softer ranges of the spring and access them. So you can see here, at the moment I'm set to the stiffest setting on the spring. That's just what I've been running with the softer spring. This is SRS2, so what that means is the ride height screw is in this hole. SRS1 means that you actually flip these two screws around and the ride height screw becomes in this one. So if you can see, there's 4mm difference between these screws. So if you have the ride height screw here, even with the same setting on the spring, you're actually 4mm further outside, making the spring harder. So what that does then is that allows you to access the harder parts of the spring. Whereas if you swap these around to how I've got them now, you'll notice that the ride height screw is inside, even with the same setting on the spring. So what that does is then that allows it to be 4mm inside. So you've got 7mm basically of travel here, but with that added SRS, you also get 4mm. So you've basically got 11mm of total travel. So what that means is where the ride height screw places pressure on the spring will vary from 11mm. So if we take the spring back off, basically at your hardest setting it'll be around here, and at your softest setting it's going to be around here. So all you're doing is you're adjusting where the ride height screw touches on the spring. And obviously that ride height screw is called ride height screw for a reason, because that screwing that in and out will adjust your ride height. So it's pretty straightforward actually, just basic engineering really. So what I'll do is I'll go ahead and put this back so you can see how it all goes back together. So that's then clipped on like that. Okay, so now is one of my tricks. If you can see on this shaft, I've got a very little O-ring. And what I do is I use that O-ring and clip it over the output shaft on the damper. Like so. I know it's a bit difficult to see, it's tiny, but there's a little O-ring on there. So basically from that, what it does is it makes sure that this shaft that's connected to the suspension to the hub, it does exactly what the damper's doing. So it translates that motion through to the damper perfectly. If you're running a lot of droop particularly, you can notice that this will actually come off the damper at some point. And what that does is that allows the last little movement of your droop to be undampened. And I'm not a big fan of that because I think that can make the car handle funny or just have some weird characteristics. So I think the best way is to keep all your droop dampened. That's ultimate, obviously. You always want, you don't want any slop in your car. If it's almost like in a conventional touring car, it's almost like having slop in your ball ends for your shock. I mean, it's going to make the car inconsistent. So for me, I like to put a little tiny O-ring. The one off the off-road shock bleed valves on the caps works really well for that. It's absolutely tiny. So that just holds everything together and stops any slop in your suspension. So basically, we can go ahead and put this back in. Next, I'm going to explain to you the how the damper actually can be adjusted. So the dampening. If you can see this slot here, that is basically how the damper attaches to the car, and then you can slide the shock in and out to change the damping. So for the spring, when you slide this out, basically it gets softer. So the more gap you set in here, the softer your spring. It's actually the opposite with the damper. So the damper, the more gap you set, the harder it is. The difference with the damper is that adjusts, when you move the whole damper, it actually adjusts your damper and your spring rate. So if you move the damper out a mil, it also means you've got to increase the 1 mil in your spring rate to soften that spring by the equivalent. Basically then you're just going to get an equivalent spring rate but with harder damping. So let's go ahead and pop this back in. It's really easy to put in and out. Just lift the suspension arm up, slide it back under the holder, and we're clipped in. So as you can see, the damper's now nicely located back in there. Just screw it in, lightly don't want to do the screw up just yet, so just leave it like a quarter of a turn loose, because we want to now be able to adjust where the damper's sitting so we can set our damper setting. We'll pop the P7 clip back onto the suspension arm. So now basically all that's left to do is just pop this back in. This is how we get our damping and shock action, so pop that back in the suspension arm. So now this is all dampened and feels like a normal shock and spring. So now what we've got to do is set our dampening. So this is where the feeler gauge comes in. So basically for the feeler gauge, I set 1mm on the damper on the front and 3mm on the rear. That's a general setting. For springs, I've been playing with the soft springs, but generally with the hard springs is what I normally run. I run 2.2 front and rear on the spring. And that's a pretty ballpark setting. We only ever run basically 0.4 of a mil left or right on the spring, and on the damper only ever really 1 mil either way. 0 obviously is the minimum on the front. Some people generally run between 1 and 0. I like a little bit harder. I think it gives the car a little bit more aggression and turn in. So I try to stick around 1 on the front, and yeah, as I said, generally about 3 on the back. So to set this, you can see the damper really easily slides in and out like this. So basically that's our dampening setting there. So what you've got to do is there's a place to put your feeler gauge, basically in between the damper and the thing that holds the damper. So if you push that and hold the damper while you've got that in place, do that up there, remove your feeler gauge. So basically that's now your damping set, and you do exactly the same for the spring. It's just a little bit of a different place where you do it. You can do the spring one out of the car actually. That makes it a little bit easier, and you can do it a little bit more accurately then, without having to muck around jamming it in the car. So basically that's how you can remove and install your dampers and shocks. It's pretty easy to take in and out of the car, quite fast. Also, it's really easy to make shock changes, as you can see. I mean, you can change the damping or the spring rate super fast. I mean, I can change probably just the pair on the front, as in I can change the spring in probably 30 seconds, so it's really fast. You got to just make sure that when you do make spring adjustments, you just double check your ride height, because obviously that ride height screw is placing pressure on a different part of the spring, and obviously that can lead to slightly different ride height. So when you're making spring and damper adjustments, just be careful to check your ride height. So basically that's it. I hope this has helped you guys. Next week I'll probably be doing one on tweaks, so how you adjust your ride height screws to get your up travel and your ride height sitting perfectly flat, and you want your droop to make sure the tyres are coming off the ground at exactly the same point, left and right, front and rear. So we'll be going through that, so just stay tuned to my channel. The new one will be posted obviously on the Facebook page. It'll be on YouTube and also on my website. If you have any questions, feel free to contact me. You can contact me on YouTube, just comment, Facebook as well, facebook.com/rcmaker1. Also contact me on my email, ryan@rcmaker.com.au, and also stay up to date in the build tips section on my website, www.rcmaker.com.au. Cheers guys.